I'm Dane Rose, and in this video we're going to explore what I believe is the most pivotal linchpin in deciding a multi-layered ecology of choices that in their entirety affect human relationships, our relationship with the environment, relationship with ourselves, our spirituality, more than any other single thing. Now, at the end of this video, you'll have a chance to assess that. But what we're going to be doing is looking at trauma from a number of different angles. And because it's a tough topic, we've got a nice bowl of raspberries and blueberries, and I'm going to encourage you to break the taboo of Western thinking and lineal left logic, denying the body, to actually move around in this video. I may stand up and move around. We may pause, but don't let this energy build up unconsciously or crammed in a mental way into your body without dissipating it. So the first step in this journey is a little bit of context, and perhaps the best place to start is who's done a good job with trauma in the past. And the earliest conscious artistic ways of working with trauma we see in Greek history with the Greek tragedies. Now, in the latest work of rediscovering, reinventing, reawakening this habit we have as a species to forget, to dissociate from, to look the other way around these areas of trauma as soon as we can. The Greeks invented the Greek tragedies as a way of coping with the fact that they were fighting 7 wars simultaneously. And so every person in the entire culture understood trauma in a very personal way. And what the latest science in trauma suggests is that it is too big to be dealt with by the conscious mind. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, the conscious mind is a lens of perception. It's not that reality isn't much bigger than the reality we perceive, but it is a limiter. It narrows our awareness down to this small point in space-time in which everything else that's going on doesn't exist for us personally. It exists. In fact, there are vast layers of dimensions that we do not yet have observing and measuring devices for. So they're not real to us in the same way that before we developed the microscope, microbes were not real to us. In fact, Louis Pasteur, when he correlated a lack of sanitary practices among surgeons with fatalities on the battlefield and in other places, was laughed at, was ignored. And Louis Pasteur started washing his hands, and his fatalities went down. And no one believed him, because if you couldn't see it with the physical eyes in that layer of chauvinistic dogma, it didn't exist. And so Louis discovered germ theory through correlation, but his peers continued to murder patients for a long time. in great numbers because they could not imagine. Their scientific minds were not big enough to imagine that something might exist that their own eyes couldn't see. And so they invented the microscope, and then the rest of the scientific community came on board, but in a very materialistic way. It wasn't enough to just apply the scientific method and apply correlation. And so it's important to understand that just because we don't have all of the observing and measuring devices that will ever be invented today, there are many things that are bigger than we can see. And in our modern use of brain scans, what we're discovering is that the Greeks got it right. What we're discovering is that trauma is too big to be dealt with directly. What we need is a symbol in between us and the traumatic energy, the traumatic event. And the reason for that is the very nature of trauma itself. Trauma, unlike normal fears and anxieties, unlike normal hurts and the whole range of things, which show up in our conscious mind. We say, oh, this area really hurts over here. But it's this area, and it's over here. You see, a very terrifying and overwhelming phenomena happens with trauma. We can see it as we look at the lens of the conscious eye, perceiving my hand. Because as it moves closer and closer and fills up more of the field of vision and more of the field of vision, it reaches a point where you cannot see anything else, where there's no distinction, where it's all 100% trauma. And this is the point where the psyche, the conscious mind, cannot deal with it. And so it dissociates from the event. It blacks it out to cope with the fact that it's too overwhelming to deal with an event at that level. It's too overwhelming. So the only way to work with that event, because unfortunately when you tune it out, it doesn't go away. You're just tuning it out. It remains a traumatic vortex. And as a traumatic vortex, you can get sucked back into that state. It's known for its timelessness. It feels like it goes on forever. Because where's the end? It's like, where does this begin and end when this is all you've known in a timeless space for hour upon hour upon hour? Where does that end? It just goes on. Because you've got the luxury in this moment of looking beyond your screen. So you say, oh, it's ending here and here. But for the trauma survivor who's experiencing that trauma, there is no edge of the screen. That pain, that grief, that horror goes on and on and on. It's as if, because of the way the brain has certain areas in it that are connected to memory and time. And one of the interesting things they've found in our current leading pioneer, which would be in the Western scientific mode, it's Bessel van der Kolk, who is laying out the tapestry, the landscape of trauma with great eloquence and using the paradigms of our culture, reductionist logic, correlation, experimentation, data, the whole spectrum. It's you and I are literally trauma illiterate, which means illiterate about one of the most fundamental forces that shapes our lives, our partners' lives, our children's lives, our parents' lives, our history as a species. We are illiterate about one of the most fundamental forces unless we have studied Bessel van der Kolk in present time. and Alice Miller, who, along with Lloyd DeMoss, is a reference for many of our guides, including Bessel, including John Bradshaw, including Robert Bly. There are many of the threads of our great pioneers in thought, in emotion, that take their way back to Alice Miller, to mythology. And in Greek mythology and in the tragedies, one of the things that they're creating is a language of symbols that when you watch a play, and the Greek tragedies were designed to articulate all of the traumas that the culture had felt. So that if you watched, and even more if you played the role, because soldiers, men and women would come back from battle and they would perform these Greek tragedies, and then they would be in the audience. And the audience they were performing for were the mothers who had lost a son, the fathers who had lost a leg, the women who had lost a husband, the brother who had lost a sister. The many different ways that in a battle on 7 fronts, tragedy, death, torture, grief afflicts an individual and a nation, were represented in the Greek tragedies, and they were played by everyone and watched by everyone, so that it was a ritual of engaging the right brain, the subconscious and the unconscious mind, with the symbol that it was not the direct event, but through the event, without getting overwhelmed by the symbol. One could weep, one could grieve, one could live safely. And what I mean by safely is as soon as your conscious self becomes flooded with the timeless traumatic memory or the timeless traumatic moment, and all you can see in every direction is trauma, to the left, to the right, before, behind, up, down, when there is no time, when there is no perspective, you are re-traumatized again and again and again, which is why it's not safe to go into traumatic memories alone. You need a guide. You need a guide on the inside. You need guides on the outside that can help you to go into the terrain where so much of the psyche is locked up in the reptilian dynamics of fight, flight, and freeze, ripping away the humanity that we otherwise have access to. In other words, in the history of brain development, which follows, if you watch the evolution of a fetus, it follows the pathway from alligator to fish to mammal to human animal to human being. And the body will take us to human animal. We don't have to do anything about that other than conceive and be born. But a traumatized child does not grow into a human being. They regress through the reptilian brain to the sociopathic state that keeps reptiles alive in a sociopathic environment that is the reptilian environment. There's no compassion between alligators. It's an alligator eat alligator world with every weakness exploited. Now, when a child experiences that environment, they don't grow into a human being and a spiritual being. They instinctively go back into the reptilian state. And every trauma re-triggers that reptilian state, which means you're ripping away the humanity from that infant. You are literally shredding the spiritual self, the human self, that will form naturally if there is love. And Abraham Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, expresses what love is. Not as a lust, selfish. Not as an attachment, I need you, selfish. Not as I have a projection about who you are and I want you to do these and these agendas for me, selfish. But the adult love that says, I want to be of service to you. In what way? In what context? In climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where are you on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? It's a hierarchy. So you don't get to work on the next step until the base step is clear. Are you in survival? Okay, well, love in survival means I'm going to take a stand for you. I'm going to see that you've got food. I'm going to see that you have shelter. I'm going to see that you're protected. I'm going to see that you are not raped. You don't have to worry about that. Now survival is taken care of. What about security? I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you. I am not going to leave you until you are safe. Security. Belonging. You are welcome here. Who you are. All of your feelings. All of your memories. All of your needs. All of your aspirations. All of your values. All of who you are is welcome here. And it is valued. It is loved. You are wanted. You are welcome. We don't get to move beyond into self-esteem and self-actualization and transcendence until that need is met. And for many it is not met. What does love look like? The willed and conscious choice in service to another human being. You will survive. And that survival will not be ripped away from you. And you belong here with dignity. Who you are is welcome. Beyond that, esteem. What are your values? Who do you want to be? How can I support you to be that person? See, this is love. This is climbing the hierarchy of needs. Now, every single human being that receives love without the agenda of the power structure naturally grows very rapidly through the reptilian, through the fish state, into starting to have feelings, the self-absorption of a mammal, moves into the human being, and then moves into the spiritual being. Because we, unlike the rest of the mammalian species, we have endogenous DMT in our brain, a Schedule 1, bizarrely illegal drug in our brain that facilitates near-death experience, transcendent moments, out-of-body experience, channeling, opening up to a sense of larger purpose, a sense of connected field. We are a part of something larger. We are part of a great field that is bigger than this little cell of an eye that I look through. This eye is part of a body, and it's part of an ecology. This body can't exist without plants. This plants can't exist without manure. This body can't exist without light. It can't exist without air. It's part of an ecology of something that is much bigger than the self. So I have my little eye that I look through. but in the endogenous DMT states of transcendence, self-transcendence, self-realization, self-actualization, self-transcendence, that highest of need, we become something bigger, not just than an animal, not just than a human being. We become something bigger than a human being. We become a spiritual being, where we understand that we are a part of what we deify. That whether we deify love or power or knowledge or creativity or beauty or magnificence or wonder, that whatever it is that is out there in these magnificent volumes, these giant scales, that we are a part of that. That when we breathe out, we breathe into that field. And when we breathe in, we breathe in from that field. That these senses are connected doorways between this limited sense of self and this much bigger sense of self. That on some level, it is all us. On some level, we are a speck of a speck of a speck of a speck of all that is. In holographic theory, you can take a hologram, you can smash it into 1,000 pieces, and then you can study the light patterns on a single piece. And from that piece, you can recreate the entire hologram. Because there is a macrocosm, microcosm echo, that at every scale, the entirety is reflected just on a smaller level. So that when in every atom, you have a nucleus, you have the vast domain of feminine space and the electrons spinning around, and then you have the planets in the vast space and the sun, planets spinning around, that at every level there are these echoes. We can even see it in cycles. Dewey has a wonderful book, Cycles, where you can take almost any phenomena, be it the price of pork belly futures or the frequency of rain or whatever it is. You can take almost any phenomena and you can find cycles, and cycles within cycles within cycles within cycles. So you have the 1 minute cycle, the 1 hour cycle, the 1 year cycle, and then you have the 10 million year cycle. The giant waves that take all the little minute and second and hour waves with it. Every million years, every 10,000 years, there are these cycles, and it's part microcosm and macrocosm. There's this dance where within us is a tiny replication of the pattern of it all. And within it all is a vastly magnified version of us on some level. So you have this growth in the brain from human animal to human being to spiritual being. And it is at the level of spiritual human being that you have empathy, you have kindness, you have love, you have compassion. That's the first level you have that on. And what trauma does is it takes that away. It takes it away from you. It takes it away from everyone around you. Because when someone comes up behind you and whacks you over the head with a 2x4, you are no longer in the totality of all that is. You might have been meditating, etc. Someone comes up and whacks you over the head of the 2-year-old. You go back to the reptilian state. You are not safe. You go back to survival in a fight, flight, freeze mechanism. And it takes a very specific protocol to disengage that part of the brain, to come back to be a human being. And the problem with so many of our young men and women, of our infants, is they're getting traumatized again and again and again by traumatized adults that are immune to the pain from the dissociation of their own trauma in childhood. And these people are not growing up as human beings. They're growing up as human animals in a fight, flight, freeze mechanism where it's not about exploring the wonderful gift of life. It's about surviving the next bully attack, the next shame, the next rage, the next alcoholic binge, the next burnt cigarettes, the next alcohol poured down the throat, the next rape. And it is terrifying. And the thing that a child needs more than anything else in a state of trauma is a compassionate witness, is to be held, to calm down the nervous system, and to work with it indirectly, to be trusted and believed, and to have a sense of safety, that someone is going to stand between them and the next traumatic event, that someone with power will sacrifice themselves to protect the child that cannot protect themselves. And what is happening in so many cases is there is not a single adult who is willing to take that stand. And in far too many cases, there is adult after adult that betrays the role they have of leadership in any young person's life, that betrays the sanctity of that role by putting their own fears ahead of the child's needs. So that's enough heaviness for right now. So I'm going to invite us to take a little bit of a feast and enjoy the moment. You may want to move around a little bit. And the psyche has a lot of protections around trauma because there's enormous suffering there. And people get lost and flooded in that pain sometimes. And there's no one that in a trauma-illiterate culture, and it's amazing how many cultures forget, there's no one that takes a stand for someone that understands that they've just slipped into the domain of psyche in which there is nothing but pain, terror, and trauma to the left, to the right, in which they're no longer a human being. And one of the things that I wish for all of us is that we come out the other side of this process of intentional learning with a commitment to take a stand for trauma survivors in our lives, and to take a stand for the trauma survivor in ourself, the unwelcome dissociated parts that need help, that need a compassionate witness to come home, to come back into the body from which they've been banished as a coping mechanism so that the ego could move on. It's taking that part of the psyche that is flooded with that pain and pushing it to one side, taking enormous energy to divide the self, and then pushing an enormous energy to keep that part separate. Exhausting. I've spent so many hours of my life, so many decades, in the exhaustion of constantly managing invisible emotions that were too overwhelming to invite back without help and without that help showing up. So, ooh. Some blueberries here and strawberries. I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that the help that we need to receive with trauma does not have to be human. And that's a very good thing, because I have yet to meet the human that could and chose to help me effectively with my trauma, which, has left parts of me going insane, parts of me shutting down, parts of me addicting. There's a whole series of coping mechanisms, and this is as good as any a time to just draw attention to the fact, it's not terribly lighthearted during our break, that within any individual, there are actually three elements. The authentic self we came in with, the wound that emerged when most of who we were was not welcome, was traumatized, was violated, was excluded. And it's very important to know that the psyche is far bigger than the cult of any culture. So there's the wound of being divided from ourself to fit into the boxes provided by the given cult of a given culture. This is so painful, so traumatizing, that a third part of the self is created to manage the pain. So you've got the self, the wound, and the pain management structure. Now, in any given action, in any given moment, one, two, or all three can be talking. In every interaction we have with someone, it can be some mix of who they really are, their cultural wound, and their coping mechanism. You can be with someone like, oh, I've got to go. And why did they have to go at this important moment in the conversation? Was it out of alignment with who they really are? Or was it bringing up too much pain, and so the wound is pushing it back? Or was it engaging the coping mechanism that says that anytime something a little uncomfortable comes up, I run away? That's my coping mechanism. So this is not who I am. This is the drug that I take to manage this level of pain. And it's important to understand the depth of addiction along these lines, because when you are in a traumatic level of pain, the coping mechanism for managing that pain always comes before the relationships in that person's life. If you're with an alcoholic, you know that the bottle is more important than you. Why? Because the bottle numbs pain more effectively than you do. So when someone's experiencing a demiurge of that uprising of memory, that part of the dissociated self starting to make itself known, their coping mechanism to handle that amount of pain and push it back is the bottle. Once they're drunk enough for 2-3 days, for a night, for this, that, the other, once they've done their antics, their control, their rage, their dominance, their humiliation, whatever it is that is part of their distraction, their coping mechanism of the pain. Once they've managed the pain, then you are most important again. And then they're very apologetic. Oh my gosh, what did I say? What did I do? I'm so sorry. Because you are never more important than managing that level of pain. And because those coping mechanisms are their painkillers. And unless you understand that pain, honor that pain, and work with them to heal that pain more effectively than that bottle, unless they're willing to go into the deepest, darkest places of their psyche, you will always, and with you the relationship will always be secondary to the addictive coping mechanism. You may say, I don't drink. That's fine. You can addict to work. You can addict to pornography. You can addict to sex. You can addict to sugar. You can addict to control. You can addict to self-pity. You can addict to shame. You can addict to rage. You can addict to anything you want. And the addiction, the obsessive focus on something, regardless of its appropriateness, comes before you. You want a leisurely time out, and you want to feel like you're special, and your anniversary is important, and da-da-da-da-da. And your partner feels a wave of shame coming up on that afternoon, and they start their porn addiction. The clock gets slower and slower, and it keeps going by. They're like, okay, I'm not ready to leave this. I've got to focus on something obsessively until this pain passes. And they don't show up, or they're late, or they're distracted again. And again, you get the message. You are not as important as my coping mechanism, whatever it is. And many people are afraid of the shame that they feel and anticipate coming from you. They are afraid of the shame that they feel and anticipate coming from you if they tell the truth. Why are you late? I don't know. I just watched the time go by and go by and go by, and I couldn't stop masturbating. I couldn't stop drinking. I couldn't stop smoking. I couldn't stop gambling. And I know exactly how you feel, and I knew how you would feel, and it didn't matter. Because I was in the hold of something that is much bigger. And I don't know what it is. I just know I couldn't stop whatever I was doing. I had to call that extra client. Now, I can say I'm doing it for this family. No. I can't face my feelings in an emotionally illiterate culture. And so I'm going to do this, and this, and this, instead of what you need me to do, to honor us, to make us sacred. To make something sacred, you sacrifice something else to protect what is sacred. The addict sacrifices the relationship to protect their pain management system. And most relationships sacrifice the soul to appear normal, thus ensuring the divided self and the chronic underlying pain that must be medicated by so many coping strategies. In any interaction, you are dealing with some mix of the authentic self, the pain of the cultural wound, the divided self. Nothing is more painful than the divided self. And the coping mechanism that allows us to get through the day in that amount of pain. you will never come ahead of someone else's coping strategy, because managing that level of pain is essential to cope, to survive, when that amount of pain is present. And it is present in all of us, and more present for many of us in the West, though it is more numb, paradoxically. So there's a lot of confusion. If you understand that, the kindest thing is to make the mechanism conscious. Number one, make it conscious. I'm starting to feel this level of pain. I've got about 6 different coping mechanisms I can do, but I've got to get on one of them fast. Is there any way that we can go through this ride together? Can you sit on my lap as we watch porn? Do you want to come drinking with me? Do you want to talk about this grief? Do you want to, I need to drive fast. Do you want to get in the car? Do you want to be with me? Or do you want to give me the space to manage this level of pain? And I will come back to you. This is not about loving you. It's particularly painful when the coping mechanism is sex addiction, because it's not about not loving the partner. It's about that is the fastest way to anesthetize the wall of pain that I don't know how to deal with, in a culture that is happy to teach me about algebra, which I've never used in my entire life, but will not teach me a goddamned thing about a single emotion in the pubescent years in which emotions are exploding in the body, and every adolescent would love to gain mastery and attunement in their relationship skills, in their sexual skills, in their coping mechanism, and understand that this pain that they're feeling is not theirs. It is the culture that is dividing them. The pain is within the cult of divisive self that is demanded of every human being as a prerequisite in every cult for them to meet their needs to survive, feel secure, and belong. This cult is brutal to people who don't fit in. And unfortunately, the cult that they are asked to fit into is killing them, because it is so unbalanced that the disease, imbalance leads to disease. The more imbalanced, the more energy it takes to maintain that imbalance. Grace is in the center. We are a massively imbalanced culture, creating massive disease, leading to massive dissociation, leading to enormous pain, leading to coping mechanisms. And the person who does exactly what they're told in this culture just keeps their mouth shut, smiles, doesn't say anything negative about all the things that are going on in them, does the perfect A student, goes out and has 2.1 kids and gets a corporate job, is amongst the sickest individuals in the culture, the most dissociated from themselves, not the healthiest. So we have a real problem when the cult itself is leading to the pain that then must be managed in some way that the cult shames. The cult doesn't apologize to addicts for hurting them to such an extent that they need to numb that amount of pain. The cult doesn't apologize. It shames. It shames people individually. It shames them by pretending that there is no pain. Well, then why are all these addicts? They've actually done studies, one of the big cover-ups, that shifts attention away from cultural dynamics. We'll take a few munches here. Is the belief that things like heroin or whatever are innately addictive. And they prove this by faulty experiments where they will put a rat away from his friends in a blaring white cage. So you're actually traumatizing the rat prior to giving them the chance to have cocaine or heroin. And they will take the drug to avoid the abuse of the environment created by the scientist, which is not a normal or healthy environment. But if you take the same rats and you put them in lovely natural settings with other healthy, well-fed rats and alternative food sources, none of them want the cocaine or the heroin. It's not addictive when there are healthy alternatives. It's addictive when every time the drug wears off, you're struck with the horror of your memories, the horror of what you've done, the fact that you are not forgiven and have not forgiven, the guilt of what you haven't done, the perfectionism you haven't achieved. It's like, already it's too much. Give me some more drug. And so there is a real incentive pattern, that the drug takes you away from that. And then there are sometimes withdrawal symptoms, from the drug that make it even worse. But healthy people who have real alternatives, even Vietnam veterans who mostly took heroin, and opium and various things in Vietnam from Thailand. They would buy the drugs in Thailand, and they were addicted when they were asked to burn a country, to shoot and bomb and burn alive men, women, and children. A horror that destroys the spirit. When asked to do that, they rather the numbness of opium and cocaine. But those that were able to forgive, release, and had healthy options outside of the war memories, when they returned, stopped taking the drug. Those that had no healthy alternative continue to this day. And the suicides from Vietnam, from the flashbacks of killing innocent children, burning women alive, burning an entire country, violating the feminine, the land, the innocents, the children, the women, violating the feminine. The trauma of that is so horrific. And the complicity within the culture of the silence around that, of the absence of grief, of the absence of apology. Apology to Vietnam, apology to the veterans, apology to the relatives. The absence of apology, the absence of grief, leads to a sustained chronic pain that must be medicated or escaped by suicide, if not a drug or alcohol. And our government does not respond to these people. I met one of the handlers of Vietnam veterans He says he's paid by the Veterans Administration to try and talk a veteran not into killing themselves by encouraging them to get totally drunk or shit-faced or take drugs, whatever it takes that person to get through the night so they don't kill themselves. And this is viewed as an improvement. To live a chronically addicted life without real support. This is also a murder of our spirit. That we send young men to be traumatized. That we teach them to be reptiles, to function effectively in their fight, flight, freeze, survive reptilian brain. But we do not bring them home with a healing that allows them to be human or spiritual beings. We rob their soul of their humanity, and we rob everyone around them of their humanity for the rest of the life. This is inhuman. There is no humanity in that. There is no honor. And in this way, we kill our spirit. We divide the self. We cause so much pain that the addictive and the medicative cycle continues. Let's take a pause.